while they get themselves set up, I'd like to very briefly introduce us to two history PhD students, Jorge Felipe and Andrew Barsom, who are going to be presenting, hopefully, BARDSS, the Baptismal Record Database for Slave Societies. So the PowerPoint's on the desktop. So just minimize that, and you should see it on the left. It should be in the middle. There you go. Okay, so I just hold both of these.
Andrew's the only one who's going to talk.
Okay, so let's mic you up.
All right.
You have to do both. And then you can put these in
All
your
right.
pocket, or you can hold them, whatever you like.
I will
Thanks.
hold them. All right, so we good?
Escape.
Okay. All right, so Jorge and I are presenting a project that we've been working on for a little more than a year now, the Baptismal Record Database for Slave Societies here at MSU. And so really to understand this project, we have to take a step back and actually look at a different digital project that's been going on at Vanderbilt for a little more than 10 years now, called the Ecclesiastical and Secular Sources for Slave Societies Project, which is headed by Dr. Jane Landers, who's an eminent historian of colonial Latin America down there. And so what they've been doing is they've been going to particularly church archives in various places in Latin America and making digital copies of records there that are, many of them in quite poor condition. These are churches in rural Cuba, rural Colombia, places that don't necessarily have a lot of funding for preserving 200, 300, sometimes 400-year-old documents, and putting them online. And so the problem with this is that you have right now a website hosted by Vanderbilt, which is very nice, and you can go and you can look at all of these documents, but you have literally hundreds of thousands of images of documents written in 200-year-old, 300-year-old, 400-year-old handwriting, right? Sometimes these images are very difficult to read. So it's for somebody looking for the content of these records. A lot of these records are things like baptisms, marriages, burials, and so on. It's really difficult. So what we decided to do is take just one set of these documents, baptisms, and try to make the content of these records accessible for people who are not going to have hundreds of hours at their disposal to weed through this massive dump of images of these documents. And so we chose baptism records for a couple reasons. One of them is these are documents produced by the Catholic Church. And one of the great things about the Catholic Church for historians is that it's this large centralized institution that tends to produce very similar documents all over the world over a long period of time. So if you look at a baptism from one place at one time, baptism from another place at another time, these are going to be very similar. So it makes it very easy to develop a standardized platform on which to host this information. And the other reason that we chose baptisms is Jorge and I both study the Atlantic slave trade and the forced migration of Africans to Latin America. And baptismal records, in many cases, in fact, in our case, contain baptisms of African slaves brought to the Americas and of their descendants. So this is what's available online right now through the ESSS project. These are different sites of church archives that have digitized records. Here are a couple other ones. These are not through ESSS, but the Archdiocese of New Orleans has their records online. These are in Spanish and French. The National Archives of the Dominican Republic, I believe, has some records from churches up there. And so let's take a look now at what these documents are and what the contents are and what they contain and how we can use them. So this is a typical baptism record. This is from Matanzas, Cuba in 1830. And so this is generally the kind of information that appears in every baptism. We have the date of the baptism, the name of the priest, the church where the baptism was performed, the age, the type of person being baptized, the age category, the date that the child was born. If it's an infant, adults, obviously, we don't have this information. The affiliation of the person, whether the parents were married or not. These are the parents. The legal status of the parents, in this case, they're slaves, and here's their owner. And the name of the person being baptized. And then finally, the godparent or godparents, in this case, just the godmother. And so the thing that's remarkable is these are pretty much the same everywhere. As you can see, we have a huge range of records from very different places, very different times. And again, we see the same format. At the beginning, the date. Then we have the name of the person being baptized. We have the godparents down here at the bottom. It's the same stuff. So it really lends itself to a standardized database format. And so what we did is we basically took all this information that appears in these records and we decided to structure it and decide, well, so what's in here? So it all relates to the baptized individual, right? Without the person being baptized, there is no baptism. So all the information in these records relates to this person. So we mapped out all the kinds of stuff that appears with regularity. And the result is, and this is not exactly the structure of the database we have, we ended up with more of a relational structure than a hierarchical structure, which is kind of what's pictured here. But we ended up with a standardized database. And instead of just going through and showing you the kind of things that we can do with it, the graphs, all that kind of stuff, in the interest of time, I figured I'd just show you guys the website for inputting data into this database, and that'll probably give you a better sense of what we're working with than anything that I could present in the next couple minutes on a PowerPoint. So, Jorge's going to bring this up here. All right, so I don't know if you guys can see this, if this is too small on your screens. But so what we have here is, these are the different tables in our database, right? We have baptized individuals, churches, nations, owners, priests, provinces, places, sort of sub-regions where these would have taken place, and ships. And I won't get into that. There's a reason that's there, and that's sort of a subcategory of baptisms. But just taking a look at a baptized individual, let's say we wanted to add an individual to this database. So we have, again, see the name. We can enter a name here, Juan. The gender, Juan would be a guy. Race, sometimes the document will make mention of race, right? Right here we have Spanish racial categories from 19th century Cuba. Obviously we can add more racial categories as we expand the database to more places where there are different conceptions of race and different racial terminologies used. Let's say for now they don't make any mention one way or the other. Legal status. We have affiliation, right? So let's say he's an adult, so we don't know whether his parents were married or not, right? Because he was born in Africa and it's not attested to in this record. We have the nation, right? Which is really what this is this is a larger category that we're calling origin. And so what generally happened is when African slaves were brought to the Iberian Americas, Spanish and Portuguese America, they were identified as belonging to a certain African nation, right? Nationality. Now these are not necessarily African ethnicities per se, right? These tend to correspond to regions of the African coast, but it'll tell you a little bit about where in Africa this person came from. So here's a list of just some of them that are in here. So let's say this person's Lukumi, right? Lukumi corresponds broadly in Cuba, 19th century Cuba, to probably what we would today call Yoruba-speaking people in Western Nigeria. Age category, this person, say he's an adult. Owner, and so again we have, because many times you have the same owner that owns dozens of different slaves, so we have a separate table for owners, so you can relate individual slaves baptized to specific owners. So let's just throw this guy in here, Josef de Fuentes. Date of baptism, right? This is in every record. So we have a nice little calendar here. Let's 1785, 15. And then we have the priest who performed the baptism, the church where the baptism was performed, right? Same thing, tables for each of those. And then relatives, right? And so let's say we know the person's godmother, right? The godfather. Let's say the godfather's there. We can add a godfather, add the name, the race of this person, the gender, legal status, nation, all the information that you can add for any other individual in the database. You can add parents, mother, father, sometimes grandparents are mentioned.
Visualization.
We don't have to. So as you can see, we have basically sort of a fairly simple relational database set up here. And the final product, the user interface for this, not the data entry user face, but the final product for users going into the website that this is going to be hosted on, this is going to be hosted online for free through Matrix here at MSU, is going to contain some visualization tools. So you can search through all this data. Yep, we're running out of time here, so I can't really go into too much detail. You can do sort of all kinds of advanced searches. You can create tables with the data, graphs, charts, all kinds of stuff to make this data meaningful and useful for historians, right? So it's not just a big list, but it's useful stuff. And we're out of time here, so we can't really go into any more detail, but we'd be happy to take any questions you guys have. Thank you.
So what purpose, you know?